Edition of India's World with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Investors are closely watching the progression of the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act in Washington for fear that it will further sharpen the risk of making investments in the city. For the moment, the city remains the primary offshore hub for those wanting to do business in mainland China, despite over 5 months of disruptions caused by anti-government protests, with the main damage thus far to sentiment rather than material loss of earnings. But equally unanimous is the feeling that with the pace of the escalation in Hong Kong situation in recent months, this could change very quickly with the bill that could pave the way for diplomatic action and economic sanctions against the city's government, adding to the pressure. For many, the act, which was passed by the US Senate on Tuesday, is just the latest in a long line of issues to have damaged the city's risk profile over the past 6 months, adding to a complex, uncertain picture, almost a parallel reality to Hong Kong's erstwhile image as a stable, secure trade and financial hub. On this edition of India's World, we will analyze the protests in Hong Kong and what it means for the financial hub, India and the region as a whole. Joining me on the program today are Ashok Sajjanhar, former ambassador, Professor Swaran Singh, Chairperson, Centre for International Politics, JNU, and Jaidev Ranade, President, Centre for China Analysis and Strategy. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Mr. Ranade, let me begin the program with you. Let's first try and understand and analyze, should India be concerned about what's happening in faraway Hong Kong?
Well, there are two aspects here. One is the political aspect, which is that China had given an undertaking that it will maintain one country, two systems policy, which seems to be now questioned. And certainly the large section of Hong Kong's population has in a way challenged the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party and its rule in Hong Kong. That's one aspect. The second is the economic aspect. The importance of Hong Kong to China has dwindled steadily over the past few years. Today, it's around 7 to 8% of its of the value that it contributes to China. Shanghai and Shenzhen, the two major cities and economic centers in China, have far exceeded it. So Hong Kong's importance to China has gone down. The troubles, which are now entering the 6th month, have also meant two other things. One, the people who are providing services and the labor in Hong Kong, they have been badly hit. They are living actually on subsidies and doles which are being dished out by some prominent Hong Kong businessmen who obviously don't want to be named, but I think the people generally know who they are. The second is a lot of Hong Kong businessmen are moving their assets, the wealthy businessmen are moving their assets out of Hong Kong, currently on a temporary measure, but they're also preparing for a long-term shift. That is the second thing that has happened. And the third is the manner in which the troubles are going on and the inability of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region authorities to really crack down on it for 6 months indicates also that the sentiments against anti-China sentiments are deeper than what can be presumed. So I think even if the Chinese do crack down and are able to bring it under control, which I'm sure they will, I anticipate that they've already started, the signs are already there, that they've started moving in. Whether the sentiments of the people, the popular sentiments, will quieten down for a considerable period of time or not, that is what remains to be seen.
Okay, all right. So what's at stake for India really with everything that's happening in Hong Kong, Ambassador?
I think whatever happens as far as China is concerned, India has to be watchful. India has to see how things are evolving, how things are developing. And the manner in which things have been happening in Hong Kong over the last 6 months or so, you know, the way I look at it is that first coming after the 2014 Occupy movement, umbrella movement and so on and so forth, the Chinese authorities would have thought that they have been able to take care of the pro-democracy sentiment, you know, the Occupy people. And even in the 2016 Legislative Council elections, those who were elected, even the elections were overturned because they did not meet the requirements, the criterion of the central government. And there is nothing really that the pro-democracy movement supporters could really do anything about it. So I would have thought that they took it that as far as the pro-democracy movement is concerned, they have been able to deal with it adequately, and so they can move forward. And that is how earlier this year they started with this extradition bill, that those who are charged of certain crimes, that they can be taken on the mainland, to the mainland for trials. Of course, this was not acceptable to the people there, because I think whether it is the judicial independence or the other freedoms, they have been thinking that the protesters were thinking that these are being eroded very rapidly, their freedom of association, or freedom of speech, etc. And so there was this protest. Now, I must confess that first, when it was the move was suspended indefinitely in June and then withdrawn completely in September, that to me did come as a surprise, which meant that China was willing to move a little forward, yes, to concede something. But after that, what has happened, and particularly, if you take the comment of Xi Jinping when he was going back from here, from Mahabalipuram, and he stopped over in Nepal, and he said that bodies will be smashed and bones will be crushed if anyone tries to divide China. Those are very, very strong words for any president to say, and particularly for a president who has been anointed, so to say, for life. Even after 2023, he can continue to seek re-election. So he should be very self-assured and confident, and the manner in which China has been moving. So for him to use those words, and not on Chinese territory but outside, which was really also a message to the foreign powers. What you mentioned about the two bills in US Congress, the sort of statements that have been coming out from the United Kingdom in terms of the manner in which China has been dealing with the protesters. So those were a message, definitely, as far as those people, as far as the other countries are concerned. So I think there is a sense of pressure on China itself. I would tend to agree with what Jaidev has said, that China will start moving in. This is for the first time that all the 452 seats are being contested. Otherwise, earlier, many of the seats used to be sort of, just it used to be a walkover, no contest, uncontested for pro-Beijing, pro-China parties, contestants. So here, all of them are being contested.
Sure.
We have seen that more than 500,000 people have come onto the streets to protest. And this has really gone on much longer than any of the protests earlier, whether in 2003 or 2014.
Sure. Right.
So I think China is also seeing and opening its cards slowly but carefully.
Right.
So as far as India is concerned, I think so far our approach has been wait and watch, see how it develops. And I think that, in my view, currently is the right policy.
Sure.
Unless things sort of take a turn for the worse, and then we need to decide as to how we respond to it.
Okay,
yes.
All right. So, Professor, let me bring you to the picture now. So, since we're speaking about China as well, let's talk about mainland China and talk about what all of this means really that's happening in Hong Kong for Xi Jinping and mainland China.
Internally, now continuation of protests in Hong Kong are being cited as the fundamental, the foremost challenge to the leadership of President Xi Jinping. So that kind of insinuation is being built internally. But I think the Senate passing that legislation is interesting, because only United States can pass legislations at home and take international initiatives. So in that sense, as you said, it could open possibilities of censure and sanctions, etc. But I want to recall in 1978, US Congress had also approved a Taiwan Relations Act. But if we see how that has come into operation, that has hardly done any great help to Taiwan other than tactical use of that legislation. So I think, again, this legislation, as far as Hong Kong is concerned, doesn't have value beyond tactical maneuvering. and then would be part of the continuing about 18 months now, the US-China trade war and the fact that repeatedly they have failed to come to strike any deal on that subject. So it at best has a tactical use for United States to build pressure on China overall in streamlining their bilateral relations. Because so far all 18 district councils are controlled by pro-Beijing parties, and even one of them shifting to pro-democracy, which doesn't look very likely at this stage, could be then seen as again a success of protesters and that impact of pro-democracy movement in encouraging United States to build that pressure at international level. United Kingdom is already talking about it. So in that sense, I think at best tactical move, but how ground situation evolves in Hong Kong would again tell us as to what will be the result of that legislation that is being passed, how far United States can continuously push that issue in coming times. What is also important is to see that Hong Kong itself is suffering a great deal. And I think domestic people there would also begin to be a bit disillusioned with the fact that nothing is coming out of it. So half of the visitors to Hong Kong have come to half now. And surprisingly, China, which is celebrated for unprecedented growth rate, now has Hong Kong in recession. So will the people be disenchanted with that kind of continuous outcome of these protesters? Beijing again obviously is pushing it much far. Just very quickly, the basic law, Article 68 clearly says that ultimately all elected bodies will move to universal suffrage, one person, one vote. And that Beijing has been really reluctant and slow in allowing that. In 2010, there were reforms and they said, okay, we could add 10 more to the Legislative Council. 5 will be directly elected, 5 will be elected by the district councils. District councils are elected again directly. So there is an effort to stonewall and slow down the process of democratization of Hong Kong. But also important to understand that there was no democracy in Hong Kong until it was being shifted to China. Britain never had any democracy in Hong Kong. It's only 1984 when they set the date of July 1997, the date for shifting of sovereignty of Hong Kong, that Britain begins to talk about democratizing Hong Kong. And 1995 was the first Legislative Council which was actually elected directly. So I think it's a very complex situation where China is trying to really stonewall, slow down the democratization process. Hong Kong and its other supporters outside and inside are trying to push it towards universal suffrage. I don't see that happening in a hurry at all.
Okay, all right. So, Mr. Ranade, the Ambassador Sajjanar spoke about, what led to these protests and how it went ahead. But what is the crux of the problem now? What is it that the people of Hong Kong want, and to what extent is Beijing willing to go? The professor spoke about Hong Kong going into recession, Hong Kong going through a tough phase. You mentioned it in your opening remark as well financially, because let's not forget it's a financial hub at the end of the day. So how far is Beijing also willing to go to ensure that it gets what it wants?
Since you asked a number of questions, let me address 2 of them quickly. The first is what Ambassador Sajjanar spoke about where is Hong Kong headed? Where are these troubles headed? Frankly, I don't think even the protesters know where really they're going. As I said, the sentiments, anti-China sentiments seem to have gone quite deep. Let's not forget that at the height of the protests, there were over 1.5 million people who came out on the streets. And at the lowest point, there were about 300,000 in terms of public protests. The students are still there in the Hong Kong Polytechnic and other places. The police has resorted to tougher measures over the days. But as the police resort to violence, the following weekend, again, the numbers of protesters rise. So I think the sentiments have spread a lot. There seems to be a bit of an impasse, leaving Beijing or the Hong Kong authorities, I think, with little choice except to crack down very hard. But here, if I can address the second point, which was briefly touched upon, is what is Beijing's role in all this? And here I would point to the fact that the protests have continued for 6 months and there was no action by Beijing till October. I think that is pertinent. There are indications or there are hints that this has led to or meant a weakening of Xi Jinping's own position. because there was lack of consensus in the Politburo on how to deal with Hong Kong. And I say that particularly because Xi Jinping himself, as way back as January, had raised the issue of what they call color revolutions, which in the Chinese lexicon is like a red rag to a bull. And later on, at the Beidaihe meeting, they have called Hong Kong a color revolution, which is why it was in that context that Xi Jinping made the remark about shattering the bones, etc., at Kathmandu, and repeated that remark more or less in Brazil recently. So, they have accepted that. And it is after the fourth plenum meeting in October that they have actually started moves to really crack down on Hong Kong. So I think when we are looking at this, we have to see it from two dimensions. One, Beijing's apprehension that this trouble in Hong Kong could spread to other parts of China, which they have so far successfully managed to contain. The second, a weakening within the Politburo of Xi Jinping's position, whether it is actually so or not. And a lot will depend on how he deals with Hong Kong. If he's able to come out of it properly, he's okay. Otherwise, I think we could see inner party kind of frictions developing. So that is how I look at it. Otherwise, as far as the economy is concerned, I don't think China is too worried about Hong Kong's economy as long as there is stability and the people get the basic needs. I don't think projecting Hong Kong as an economic center will be at the top of Beijing's priorities.
Sure. So stability will be at the top of their priority as far as Hong Kong is concerned. And having been said, Ambassador, so, as far as Beijing's options are concerned, or more particularly Xi Jinping's options are concerned, what are they likely to be going forward? Do you see China or Beijing dealing with Hong Kong with an iron hand in the days to come to try and quell everything that's happening there? Or do you see Xi Jinping giving the protesters in Hong Kong a bit of a long rope?
My short answer to that would be that I would see China taking the tough measures. Even as far as Carrie Lam, the administrator, is concerned, she's also known to be a tough fighter. And she's been with the Hong Kong administration for the last more than a decade. And so she's experienced it all. She's seen what happened in 2014, 2016, etc. So she knows about this place. And so I would tend to see that China would in all likelihood, act tough and try to sort of quell the whatever disturbances are taking place. Now, after all, if we see what have been the demands of the protesters, and they said 5 demands, not one less. And out of those 5, one has been taken care of, which is the total withdrawal of this extradition bill. But if we were to see what are the other 4, number 1 is all these protests that are happening, not to term them as riots. So, take them as normal law and order situation. Then as far as police brutalities are concerned, to take action against those. The third one would be in terms of taking back all any sort of action against protesters. And the last one is in terms of universal suffrage, both in terms of election of the chief executive as also as far as the legislative councils are concerned. Chief executive, we know that it is elected by 1,200 people from different constituencies. And that they would like universal suffrage. I think if one has to see as to how China might react, might respond, maybe on some of these issues, it could extend some sort of an olive branch. But I think on the most fundamental aspects, which is in terms of universal suffrage, in terms of democracy, although one shouldn't forget also that 2015, China had offered one man, one vote, but then they had wanted to retain the right to be able to screen all the candidates for the chief executive.
Right.
And the Hong Kong protesters, even at that time, had decided not to accept that offer from Beijing, because they thought that if that was accepted, then this whole issue of screening for the chief executive, that power, that authority will continue to be with China. So I think there is, on some of these issues, China might relent. But I think one of the problems as far as the demonstrators also is concerned is that there is no leadership.
Right.
And so they really do not know how to go about it as far as, the Polytechnic University thing is concerned. How many people were holed up inside it? They were asked to come out. What is the sort of support that they still enjoy? Because Beijing says that these protesters have lost all support of the people. The people are now with the Beijing administration because they have really seen their city going to seed.
Right.
And that is not what they want to happen. While the protesters still maintain that they have support of the ordinary people, and it is the students who have got in.
Right.
And so I think it is both economics and politics together. But China today is looking at this more in terms of politics rather than economics.
Okay, all right, Professor. So, talking a little more about China, the West is making a lot of noise about what's happening in Hong Kong. There is equal rhetoric from Beijing's side, really responding to some of that criticism that's coming from the West. Is Beijing, at the end of the day, really concerned about what the West thinks as far as Hong Kong is concerned?
Surely, China is very conscious of how the major powers are responding to situation in Hong Kong. Two things. One, you can notice about a dozen plus places right now around the world where protests are happening. But protests in Hong Kong are getting enormous amount of visibility, partly because China is at the center of global system now. And it draws greater attention among major powers as to what happens in any part of China. Hong Kong is relatively more accessible in terms of being able to reach there and for media to see what is happening there. They have access to outside world. So that's one, that it is perhaps getting more attention than in a normal situation any other protest would. Second fundamental dichotomy is the fact that China is a one-party system. It's a country where party owns the country, not country owns the party. And Hong Kong has about right now more than 24 political parties which are active and major players in the game. And that's a very different system. So in that sense, even if democratization has to take place, the challenge for China is how to create a kind of a democracy where you have that large number of political parties. And even if you look at coalitions, there are largely three kinds of coalitions: pro-Beijing, pro-democracy and the neutrals. There are three sets of political parties operating there. So not only the problem of leadership among protesters, but also among singular leadership among Hong Kong politicians. That is again a challenge to Beijing. Beijing definitely wants to make sure that the West does not really use it as a kind of arm twisting instrument for Beijing, because then it gets related to several other areas in China which could get connected, not only in terms of being inspired by what Hong Kong achieves or does not achieve, but the fact that there is a larger glare on Hong Kong and from there glare on other areas of China.
Right.
So it could get Beijing into greater difficulty over a period of time. But I agree with the ambassador, if push comes to shove, China will use a heavy hand, and I'm sure they will use it very differently compared to what they did in Tiananmen Square way back in 1988. They have learned their lessons, and you will have a very smooth operation in case something of that nature has to happen in Hong Kong.
Right.
Hopefully that will not take place, and I think elections will also tell us into which party of the two, pro-democracy and pro-Beijing, is getting kind of a certain boost of what is the people's mandate, because the huge confusion. People in Hong Kong, everybody is saying people are with us.
Right.
Who people are really supporting.
Sure. All right. Quick closing comments now from all my guests. I'm going to ask you to be brief because we've got limited time on the program with the best way forward. Starting first with you, Mr. Ranade.
Well, just to sum up, I think I have no doubts at all that Beijing has already decided on the hard option as far as Hong Kong is concerned. They have already inducted a large number of People's Armed Police personnel into the Hong Kong police since they are more capable. Xi Jinping has told Carrie Lam that she will stay on, which also indicates that Beijing is going to back her, and she's known to be a tough lady. They've changed the chief of police there. So I think hard option will be exercised by Beijing.
Right.
As the professor said, they will try and avoid Tiananmen for two reasons. One, there'll be a lot of international opprobrium, so they want to avoid that, particularly at this stage when they have a trade war going on with the United States. And secondly, I think the Chinese will be very hesitant, mainland Chinese, to have Chinese blood on their hands in Hong Kong. So I think that will be a factor. But the other point is, I think they will want to quell this. They were waiting for the elections to take place. I think that is after that we will see the movements taking place. because they are quite apprehensive that this can be used as a launch pad by others to create trouble elsewhere in China.
Okay, all right, Ambassador.
Yes, Frank, a lot of uncertainty as we go forward, and I think the next few days should provide some clarity. But, if you look at whatever is happening outside, whatever are the statements, you started the program with these bills in the Senate, House of Representatives, whether President Trump is going to sign them or not. And what I feel is, meaning, of course, America is also in a dilemma because you have the US-China trade war. The first phase of the deal is to be signed before the end of the year, and that could have implications for his own election. So there is a dilemma. But I'm convinced that irrespective of what happens as far as President Trump is concerned, signing or not signing, I think the credibility of the United States globally is rather low. That whatever they might say, whatever they might, and President Trump is known to be a very unpredictable and a very mercurial person, who's not a very reliable person.
Right.
So I don't think the Hong Kong protesters or demonstrators in any way would be banking upon any, or should be banking upon any support or any help that they might receive either from the United States or any of the international players.
Sure.
They will really have to bank upon themselves. I think after this is over, because in the last comment I would like to make is that, in Hong Kong, before 1997, things started happening 10, 20 years before that. Till it is 2047 when, these freedoms are to be provided. I think we are drawing closer to that time.
Right, sure.
And that would also be playing on the sentiments of the people that we have to get something from China in terms of universal suffrage, democratic rights, and not allow our rights to be eroded.
Sure. All right. And Professor, close the show for us.
Okay, very quickly, I think, first of all, Beijing has capabilities to make hard choices on Hong Kong. It will try to avoid. Election authorities have already said they have a backup date of 1st of December. They could postpone them. But I think they will choose to take softer option if they can. Second, this is not the first time Hong Kong is protesting. Despite several series of protests, we have seen in 20 years pro-Beijing number of candidates increasing, pro-Beijing number of sort of electorate is increasing on the ground.